Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today we're bringing you another update from the prairies, but actually this time we're going to be able to talk about some data. We're going to hear about the results from the recently completed North Dakota Breeding Duck Survey. And for that discussion, I'm welcoming in a friend of mine, Mike Szymanski, Supervisor, Migratory Game Bird Management with North Dakota Game and Fish Department. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mike.
I appreciate you joining, and I want to give you an opportunity to just provide our listeners a brief description of what it is you do for North Dakota Game and Fish.
Sure. So I'm the Migratory Game Bird Management Supervisor for our agency. So I oversee basically everything dealing with waterfowl, mourning doves, sandhill cranes, swans, geese, everything that we do here in North Dakota for migratory game birds.
Well, you are the person we need to speak with. We had Dr. Ken Richkus on an episode a few weeks ago where we were talking with him about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Canadian Wildlife Service's decision to cancel the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. And so we stepped through all that with him. But following that, I also learned that North Dakota, your agency, was actually going to continue on with their survey. And so naturally, we wanted to hear about that. It's probably the only set of data, rigorously collected data with respect to wetland conditions, duck numbers that we're going to get from at large scale from the prairies this year. So naturally, we thought this would be important to hear about and our listeners would be interested in. So let's just start with you giving a description of the type of how this survey is conducted.
Sure. Our survey, we've been conducting it since 1948. So this is our 73rd year. We actually started with aerial transects back in 48, but they were jettisoned. We were doing both aerial transects and roadside counts. The roadside counts were being used as corrections for what you miss when you're flying by at fairly high rates of speed. So we continued on since 1948 with our 8 roadside transects that we have going across the state. We typically have 1,816 miles of transect that we run across all geographies in North Dakota, running north and south. Some of the transects go all the way from the South Dakota border to the Canadian border. And we count basically everything involving ducks and wetlands on 220 yards on either side of the road. And we stop as long as we need to stop to get everything counted. We classify every wetland by type, and we classify every social group of waterfowl that we see. And that's similar protocol that the Fish and Wildlife Service uses for the big survey, the international survey that they run, where you can't just count the ducks you see. You have to know what they're doing socially because of all the breeding interactions that are happening at the time. So, a single Drake mallard gets turned into an indicated pair because you assume that hen mallard is off on a nest someplace. And then, going into how many drakes are with a given hen. And then there's a cutoff where you assume that if there's, 5 or more drakes, they're going to be out in a bachelor group, probably not involved with nesting hens anymore. So 5 is the cutoff there where we stop calling them indicated pairs. And that gives us a couple of different indications also as to how nesting phenology is progressing throughout the year. So, we count everything along those lines. We've been doing that survey, like I said, for 73 years. So it's the longest running large scale breeding waterfowl survey we believe to be in the world. So we're pretty happy about that we've been able to continue it for this long. We also have a weekly migration survey that we run in the central part of the state. That's, I believe, a 57-mile transect that we use to kind of gauge how migration and phenology is progressing, both in the wetlands and with breeding of ducks in the state. So We use that to kind of gauge the timing of our statewide survey, and then also speak to the data a little bit. Sometimes you can have pretty tremendous blips in blue-winged teal or later migrating species. So we want to have that kind of weekly trend of how those migrations are progressing.
I did not, until I read the report this year, maybe I watched a video in which you were interviewed, that I didn't realize how long the North Dakota survey had been conducted, that it's actually been conducted for a longer period of time than the international survey. And so was an interesting piece of information for me to get just by itself. So that's pretty cool to have North Dakota doing that survey for that long. It gives you quite a data set. The other thing that I wanted to ask you, you just mentioned a weekly migration survey. Now, that's a spring migration survey. I'm guessing you're probably not still doing that survey, right?
Right. So we begin that survey as ice is coming off. We actually want to go run that survey with a bunch of zeros, so we know what we start before migration. And then we try to go through the first week of June so that we capture those later nesting species like scaup and gadwall and get that kind of end. We also count wetlands on it periodically. So at spring thaw, then during the May survey, and then again in June, we count the wetlands and kind of get that trajectory as well.
So have you concluded that survey in June, or do you still have any additional aspect of that to go?
We just wrapped it up here. 2 weeks ago, I guess. First week of June. The way the calendar went this year, I think it ended on either the 3rd or the 4th. So we've got that. We've got some of those plots created, and feel good about our May survey data. Looking back at that and seeing that, we didn't do the May survey, and then the following week, all of a sudden, there was just like no blue-winged teal or no scaup. We had kind of the normal progression of migration throughout the state. With those species, with the big pulse of scaup and other diving ducks coming through in mid-April, and then blue wings were peaking about the time of our survey, but they sort of tapered off, and then by the time you get into June, they drop off quite a bit. And it's really hard to do those surveys after about the first week of June, also because of progression of vegetation growth in wetlands. At some point, you're just not very likely to find blue-winged teal pairs or drakes sitting around by themselves unless you actually start doing beat outs on the wetlands because of just the rank vegetation that's going to be up by then.
Yeah, at that point, you just can't see them. They're hiding, right? That's kind of the point you're getting at there.
Yeah, yep, exactly. So we try to take that into account when we do our May survey. We don't want to be so early that we're catching birds that haven't settled into breeding territories yet, but we can't wait so long that we're going to have 2.5, 3 foot tall vegetation growing up in wetlands trying to count birds.
That's probably another aspect of the survey that a lot of folks that probably haven't heard about, the importance of getting that timing right, because like you said, you don't want to be including all those birds that are still transiting through, and that would be settling way north into the boreal forest or even in the Canadian prairies. You want to be capturing just the ducks that are breeding there on your in North Dakota. And so, that timing is certainly something you have to think about. So thanks for sharing that information. I guess you might say immune from the effects of the coronavirus, but with respect to how you all had to navigate, did you have to make any changes to your survey protocol this year, in response to the coronavirus?
Yeah, we did actually. And we didn't change necessarily how we do our survey protocol. So the way the data was collected is still the same, but the logistics of how we went about it ended up being quite a bit different this year. We fortunately, through our leadership in the governor's office and our agency, had a pretty straightforward approach that if we were alone doing work and weren't interacting or having transmissible moments, there's no reason we shouldn't keep the doors open and keep doing our work. And fortunately, just the way we're set up and the scale of the work we were doing allowed us to do that. And, other operations, especially that big May survey run by the Fish and Wildlife Service, just, they weren't in the same boat. They have many people all over the country traveling internationally, and there was just no way that they could do it. But with our situation being a little bit smaller scale and ways to kind of encapsulate the work, we were able to make some adjustments. So we typically have a 2-person crew out. We have 4 2-person crews running the transects. And we always keep the transect assignments the same. They're always running the same direction. And when people run them, there's typically one person doing all the observations and another person recording. And then you stay in hotels and sometimes stay at relatives' houses or a friend's house, whatever. But we had to cut some of that back this year. Some of our crew members were coming from different parts of the state joining up. We had to start planning this adjustment back in April. So, even though things had largely reopened again in May, we were still kind of following these guidelines. So we had people running by themselves. We split up into 8 single-person crews and basically took more time, at stops to record the data. It was just essentially a lot more work for people individually to get the work done. And then when we had busy situations, they just voice record themselves and play it back right away to enter the data. And we enter our data into a GPS reference tablet to, have all that data geo-referenced and stored automatically in a database, which we actually started doing that before there were iPads and real tablets, which is kind of crazy to think about now. We've been doing it for almost 15 years like that. But the workload is a little bit higher for folks. I mean, it's just a lot more going on for an individual to keep your head on a swivel and finding everything, counting everything, and getting the data recording done. So the days were probably a little bit shorter in that regard. We had to move some assignments around also to accommodate driving distances. So since people were going to have to basically do several hours of deadhead driving to get to their starting or ending points. So we try to accommodate that with, the workloads we knew people would have on various transects. And then also a priority was we have a fall wetland survey that we run in mid-September just before hunting season, just to give people, our hunting public a view of what conditions are looking like as we're sliding into hunting season. So we wanted to make sure we had our overlap with those routes that we typically have. That created a little bit additional complexity, but not too much. And then we did a little bit of subsampling in places that were just lower priority habitats, farther driving distances for people, that type of thing. Just kind of where it felt like, we had never run these surveys by ourselves before. So we didn't know, if it was just going to be too much for people at times, and making sure that if we saw something that we thought might be a little bit too much, just to kind of take it off for this year and make sure that we could get a good survey done. And all of our crew members right away from the get-go, we had some conversations about what people were, concerned about or wanting to make sure they got done. But everybody was raring to go and just wanted to make sure that we got this important work done.
Well, kudos to you, your agency, and all your crew members for doing what was necessary to complete this work. It certainly stands out this year as an important piece of data, and I think it's something that's, it's going to get a lot more attention this year than I think it probably has in past years, because it's the only survey of wetland conditions and waterfowl breeding duck populations that we're going to have, at least as far as I'm aware. There may be a few other states that have done something, but I'm not heard of those yet. We'll look into that. But certainly from the prairies, I think this is going to be the highlight. So kudos for that.
Yeah.
Mike, I have one other question, and then I want to transition into the actual results of the survey. And I think I know the answer to this question, but I just want to make sure our listeners do. The survey, the North Dakota survey, and the data that you collect, and then that we're going to talk about here, that's not part of the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey that we spoke with Ken Richkus about. I mean, it's an entirely separate data set, an entirely separate process, right?
That is correct. It is a completely different survey. Some states do have their state surveys intertwined with the May survey that the Fish and Wildlife Service does. Ours is not. As we talked about a few minutes ago, we started in 1948, so well ahead of the other survey. And part of the deal there was, at the beginning, we needed to have, as a state, if we wanted to make adjustments to waterfowl regulations, we needed to have some kind of state survey. It was starting to be recognized at the time that North Dakota was an extremely important breeding area for ducks in North America. So that was kind of how our survey got rolling at that time. And then the services efforts kind of built up around it. Periodically over time, we've had some comparisons when weird numbers come up, but formally, no, we are not part of the harvest regulation setting process. And it's important too. I mean, this year, even though we're kind of the one piece of data out there for breeding ducks in the prairie region, I mean, it is really important to have that whole scale view that the survey that the Fish and Wildlife Service and its state and provincial and Canadian government partners provide that whole scale view where you see everything that's going on, because what goes on in one part might be completely different from another part. Kind of going back into the stuff that Johnny Lynch talked about with Escape from Mediocrity, where the pieces of the prairie are not all functioning the same way all the time. But what I would say about this year is that, North Dakota is a really, really important part of the puzzle. I mean, we have more breeding ducks than any other state, and our geography is one of the most densely populated by breeding ducks anywhere in the prairies. So to have a survey done this year in absence of everything else and see that we are doing pretty good in our breeding range is really important. I mean, we do from time to time have the capability to carry the prairie breeding effort. And, this might be one of those years. So I'm very happy we got it done.
So, Mike, to the point about the importance of the Dakotas for waterfowl populations, really, across North America, I went back to a previous report from the Waterfowl Breeding Population Habitat Survey, that international survey. And if you look at eastern North Dakota, or the eastern Dakotas alone, North and South Dakota granted, that area alone in some years can support, actually, I believe last year it supported 22% of the total number of ducks that were estimated in what we call the traditional survey area. That's kind of mid-continent North America, sort of west of the Great Lakes, and so 22% in the eastern Dakotas. Now, if you add in the western Dakotas and Montana, you actually capturing all of the prairie pothole region for the most part on the state side, but. That just, to your point, just shows the importance of that region. On average, maybe 14%, I think was the number I came up with for the eastern Dakotas that they have accounted for in terms of annual breeding duck population. So certainly is an important area, and I don't have the breakdown between North and South Dakota, but nevertheless, it certainly is important to your point.
So the table that you're talking about, where it breaks down the survey regions for the Fish and Wildlife Service, are Eastern Dakota's geography is roughly 7% of the total traditional survey area geography, but often carrying around 20 to 30% of the total BPOP. So very, very disproportionate importance as far as the amount of birds we carry in a small geography.
Yeah. I did not realize the significance of that area, I guess. And I mean, I did, but numerically wise, that's just something I had not looked at here recently. And so that stood out to me as I was preparing for this little discussion here. One thing, as we get into a discussion about wetland conditions and duck numbers across the state of North Dakota, perhaps start with giving people a feel for how wetland conditions, duck populations, just generally speaking, vary across the state. It's not like North Dakota is uniform in its wetland density and breeding duck population. So going, kind of from west to east, what are the parts of the state that are most important in terms of wetland numbers and duck numbers?
Well, one important note about duck numbers, we were just referencing a Fish and Wildlife Service report. One thing I have to point out is that a lot of times numbers between different surveys differ. So our numbers scale differently than the Fish and Wildlife Service numbers. They're almost always different, but they do correlate very highly. The R-square is something like 0.75 on the correlation of, what numbers are increasing or decreasing, but they do scale differently. So keep that in mind if you're ever comparing the two reports or hearing about the numbers that we talk about in our survey report and thinking about numbers that you might be more familiar with in the Fish and Wildlife Service report. Getting into your question about North Dakota's geography, and I guess the way I always explain it are the physiographic regions that we have in the state. North Dakota is one of the rectangle states in the Great Plains. We've got the Missouri River that enters in the west central side and kind of makes a sort of diagonal turn running down and exiting through the south central part of the state. Everything west of that was not glaciated during the past glaciation period. And it's not really your top duck country. It turns into high plains stuff where breeding duck densities are really quite low. You have some really isolated spots that are really, really good, but by and large, it's not your prairie pothole region. The prairie pothole region is north and east of the Missouri River system running in North Dakota. So once you're north and east of that, you're immediately going to run into the Missouri Slope. That's kind of the inside edge of the Missouri Coteau, which is the famed breeding area in North America for prairie ducks, and of utmost importance to the mid-continent region of North America for duck harvest. And that's going to be some of your highest wetland densities, wetland diversities, and also intact grassland. It represents dead end moraine from where the glacier stopped. So it's, undulating hills, loose soils, gravelly soils, not exactly top-notch farming stuff, and not very hard to find rocks that are as big as basketballs when you're digging a hole. So it's a little bit more of an intact landscape. Sliding off of that to the east and northeast, you start to hit different compositions of the drift prairie that are going to be glacial lake beds or more, lowest plains where it's just kind of rolling, small rolling hills, but a much less defined, topography. So wetlands are smaller, they're more ephemeral, easier to drain. Soil productivity is extremely high, and anthropogenic influences in the drift prairie are really quite high. There's a lot of that landscape that's been affected by people in one way or another, primarily in agricultural production. It's really good farmland is what it comes down to. And in some of those areas, there are again some extraordinarily high densities of wetlands and breeding ducks associated with them. And then moving off to the far eastern side of the state, you have the Red River Valley, which is by no imagination a valley for what people imagine valleys be. It's an old glacial lake bed that sits a couple hundred feet lower than the surrounding drift prairie and is one of the flattest places on Earth.
Yeah, it is. I can attest to that.
Again, some very, very good farmland and agricultural production out of that area, and not really much for duck habitat anymore. It really doesn't have much left for grass or wetlands.
Yeah, and so that the drift prairie, despite it being one of the more agriculturally intensive parts of the state, it also has second to the Missouri Coteau. I think it traditionally has the highest densities of waterfowl, right? Second to the Missouri Coteau, is that right?
Yeah, it is. It's a bigger geography, so it's going to carry more ducks. But yeah, when you get into pockets of good intact wetland communities, there are a ton of ducks, and they do quite well. Especially, in a year like this, when it's extraordinarily wet and, there's just a lot of places where people can't go. There's a lot of places where nest predators probably aren't going to go because it's just such a inundated mess in some areas that ducks can get into and nest that they'll probably actually do pretty good with production, even though the landscape is fairly impaired for, upland nesting cover. But yeah, it's not quite the same as the Coteau where you can depend a little bit more on production to happen. But nonetheless, I mean, the drift prairie is extraordinarily important for waterfowl migration, besides what we do out there for duck production.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
Mike, let's talk about wetland conditions first, then we'll talk about duck production, or duck numbers. What did you see across the state with respect to wetland conditions, and how do those numbers compare to long-term average and maybe what you've seen last few years?
I mean, folks in North Dakota all remember what happened here last fall. We had an extraordinarily odd fall with a whole summer's worth of rain falling in a couple of rain events and kind of extending through September and October. So it was very unusual. We also had a blizzard. Again, people wonder what duck hunting's like up here. Well, if you have a 10 to 30 inch blizzard the 9th of October, it kind of messes up duck hunting. All that translated into pretty good wetland conditions, though, for this spring. So, I mean, we weren't surprised one bit to find very wet conditions. I guess I was a little bit surprised to see that even in our western parts of the state, our wetland numbers were still up, even though it had been fairly dry. They didn't get as much rain in the fall, and they really didn't get much for snow in the wintertime. And then, boy, this spring, after we thawed out, it was dry. We really haven't had much rain in North Dakota all spring. There's a few areas that have had some good shots in the last month, which is really important. But I mean, it's gone from deluge to drought. And we always kind of joke up here that you could be 2 weeks from a flood or 2 weeks from drought. So you just never know sometimes. But overall, our wetland estimate was, even despite with it being fairly dry in the western half of the state, our wetland estimate, our wetland index was the 6th highest on record and the highest wetland index that we've had since 2014. And it just progressively got wetter and wetter as you go east. You know, what drives that number a lot is really ephemeral water, type 1 wetlands, type 3 wetlands, road ditches, drainage ditches, things like that, you know, can dry out in short order. So we had a very huge pulse of those wetland types in our survey this year, which are very good for breeding ducks. They're important. Not so much the ditches. You don't want to see a lot of ditches because it's indicative of wetland drainage. But if they've got a lot of water, it still tells you there's a lot of water on the landscape. And you know, those temporary and seasonal wetland basins are incredibly important for pair habitat by settling duck pairs, and then also the seasonal wetlands as the summer progresses to provide brood habitat.
Well, so the next big question is, what did you see in terms of duck numbers? We would expect if you have have good wetland conditions, we're going to have good duck numbers. Did that bear itself out again this year?
Yeah, it sure did. We, you know, we had our 13th highest breeding duck index on record, and got up to just short of, in our index, 4 million breeding ducks, which is a really good sign. I mean, as we kind of look at our duck numbers over the past 26 years, where once we get past 1994, we're in this kind of new era of just a lot more precipitation. We had really good duck production for a long time because of tons of CRP on the landscape, sort of the best of the best days for ducks. So our 26 highest counts have been in the last 26 years, and getting to, you know, 13th overall means we're right back to the middle of the road. And just looking at the numbers, yeah, we're like 2,000 ducks in our index off of that median or mean count for that time period. So that's really good to see. As we, you know, look through our species counts, we've got a really strong count for all of our birds. You know, our mallard count was just shy of 900,000 again. That's going to be, I think, our 18th highest on record. All of our species counts were pretty good. It was a little bit surprising to see redheads down a tiny bit. I think they were down 12%. I think in the news release, or maybe in one of the reports you read, you might have seen that green-winged teal were at a record high. And there's not too much to be made out of that because we only have about 68,000, 69,000 in that record high. So it's not a huge number. They're just not one of our primary nesting species in the state. We do run into them with broods and, you know, nests out if we're out nest searching or something like that, but kind of a small number. Blue-winged teal, however, though, we're also up almost 60%. I think they were up maybe 58%. And when we're talking about blue wings in North Dakota, that's very often our most abundant breeding duck. So we had just over 1.1 million breeding blue wings in the state in our duck index this spring. So that's a really good sign. Our numbers have been kind of trending down for a while. And what's surprising about that number as well is that as you alluded to, South Dakota is in really good shape. Very wet. Blueing teal are one of these species that as they migrate north, they'll stop at sort of the first best habitat they find. If it's really good, they'll stop and settle in. So the fact that we were still able to get 1.1 million after they probably mostly fell out in South Dakota is really good. And that bodes really, really well for duck production for blue wings, as they're a really important species in the duck harvest all over North America, and especially for these states that have extra teal hunting opportunities.
Absolutely, Mike. There's a lot to like about the survey results that y'all produced this year. I'm looking at the chart here myself and noted that blue-winged teal number, and I'm thinking exactly along the lines of what you said about what it likely also means for South Dakota. Just a quick note about those green-winged teal for any of our listeners that may be wondering why that number is so low. Traditionally, even this year, although it's record high, you said I think 69,000. That species, interesting enough, is one that's going to continue on north into the parkland and boreal forests of Canada, and then some of them head on even farther north than that. So just one of those interesting species, really small duck, but then it travels far north to some of these more northern breeding locations. So, but yeah, it looks really good from the standpoint of wetland conditions and duck numbers there in North Dakota. It'd be really nice if we had some numbers out of South Dakota, but we can probably draw some conclusions based on what we're hearing with respect to wetland conditions there. And these numbers here are even more impressive and more comforting, you might even say, when we hear about kind of the mediocre wetland conditions across much of prairie Canada, whether it be Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. It sounds like wetland conditions there are much the way they were last year, and in some cases maybe even a bit drier. So again, we'll reiterate this many, many times. That's why it's so important to preserve this entire prairie region, preserve the capacity over this large landscape, because wetland conditions are rarely going to be uniformly good across this area. We need it. We need that large landscape, the capacity preserved across both the U.S. and Canada, so that we make sure we have good habitat in place for years exactly like this, where we have favorable environmental conditions in the States. If we have good habitat in place in the States, then the ducks are going to be able to take advantage of that. And then the mediocre and more drought-like conditions in the prairies are not going to have as tremendous of a negative impact on overall waterfowl population. So this is a great year to emphasize the importance of having that capacity preserved at large scales. Mike, anything else that you wanted to comment on with respect to your observations this year? I do know that y'all are going to have an additional survey. Maybe it's a brood survey in July, but any other observations worth sharing from the breeding duck survey?
Yeah, sure. We are going to have a duck production survey that we run in mid-July. We've been running that since 1958, so that'll give us another kind of look at how ducks are doing production-wise, and we do give a fall flight estimate off of that again is our own estimate and comparable to our own numbers. So that'll come out in a news release probably later in July. And then, like I said, as our, for people wanting to hunt in North Dakota, the fall wetland survey results will also be in a news release in September. Our duck numbers are pretty strong, and we've got the capacity this year to have good duck production. So I think people should take some solace in that. We had some higher points. Our scop breeding index this year was quite high again. And from time to time, we do actually crank out a lot of scop. We have a fair number of scop broods we find. And, last year was one of those years where scop should have done really well. And scop are a philopatric species that come back to where they were fledged. So we're hoping it was an indication of that. Last year with all the late summer, fall precipitation we had grass that stood a lot longer than it normally does because of normal hanging dates. I always consider anytime you have grass standing after the 4th of July, it's bonus time for ground nesting birds. And we had a lot of stuff not get hayed until mid-August. So that bodes well for scop. They're the latest nesting species we have for ducks up here, where they're still sitting on nests going into August. So I'm hoping that's maybe what we're getting an indication of, was maybe a a really good bonus year last year on Scott production in North Dakota, because we're not typically thought of as a primary Scott breeding area.
Yeah, that is interesting. I'm glad to hear that. I also note that northern shoveler numbers were up this year. That's going to be welcome news to my supervisor, Dr. Tom Mormon. He's a big fan of shovelers and certainly not shy about taking those when he has an opportunity. So I'll be sure to relay this information to him. I say that kind of jokingly, but no, that is good to see across the board, good duck numbers. And one of the other things that the pandemic has kind of hindered, I think will hinder later this summer, is preseason banding operations. Are you all going to be able to pull off some of that banding in North Dakota? I believe Canada, at least at far northern latitudes, they had already announced that they were unlikely to be able to conduct those. But are y'all going to be able to do some banding operations in your state this year?
Yeah, we will. We have. We're just going to start Canada goose banding here next week. We had to make some adjustments to our larger scale Canada goose banding program. We had a very large operation set to go this year that kind of had us traveling all over the state with a lot of intermingling of people coming in and out of a work crew and staying in hotels, and just it was just too much cross-pollination this year. So we pared that back quite a bit to a smaller effort that we can run with a more locally based crew and not have sort of the interchange of folks on that. Our duck banding work should go ahead as planned. We run small 2-person crews, and those people are kind of together all the time anyways in their work environment. So we don't foresee any issues there. And they're run out of workstations where they're kind of working a geography around a single base, I guess you could say. So we don't have any issues there that we see coming up. We're still maybe looking at hopefully finding ways to reallocate some of the resources that we're not going to go to Canada this year and make up for some of the data gaps. We obviously won't have the same geography covered, but hopefully can get enough bands out to inform our parameter estimates that we use in harvest management every year.
Well, Mike, that's probably going to do it for us. Whenever we started this, I guess before we started recording, I said we might, about 20 minutes on this episode would probably be about right. And it looks to me like we're getting closer to the 40-minute mark, but that's kind of the way it goes when two people get together and start talking about ducks. But nevertheless.
Yeah.
That's okay too. That's okay too. We had a lot of good information to talk about and to share. And so thank you for joining us. And on behalf of everyone here at Ducks Unlimited, I just want to say thank you to you, the North Dakota Game and Fish Department, and everyone else there in your agency for the great work that y'all do, that y'all have done this year, and the work that y'all do every year with respect to supporting wetlands conservation, your contribution to the data that helps us understand and better manage the population. Just all around, we appreciate you and your partnership and all the work that you do for Waterfowl.
Thank you, Mike.
All right, Mike, thanks for your time.
You bet. Anytime.
Special thanks to our guest on today's show, Mike Szymanski with North Dakota Game and Fish Department. We appreciate him sharing his time and telling us about some of the great results that they found from a recent breeding duck survey they conducted in that state. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great work that he does getting these podcasts edited and out to you, our listeners. And of course, to you, the listeners, we thank you for your time and spending it with us, and we thank you for your support of wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the ducks.